Hey everyone, welcome to part 23 in this FXS Lowrider restoration series. If you're first joining us, you can click on this link in the top right corner. We'll take you to a listing of all the videos. You can click on the first link or whatever link you left off from and continue from there. In the last video I addressed the spaghetti that was the rear brake lines, removing a large section and re-terminating. I removed the entire oil cooling system and thermostat, disassembled it, and flushed it with kerosene. Made repairs to some electrical connections that I had documented. Trued up the front and rear engine mounts that was part of the initial damage of this motorcycle. Repaired the bent cooling fins. Our friend Jason from the Bug Ranch stopped by and helped us lift the engine into place. The engine was mounted and shimmed using accepted and best practices. Engine guard modifications were done and the front was then torqued down. The extra shim material was removed, the area cleaned up, and then painted. In this video, we'll be putting on the heads, torquing them down, putting on the upper mounts, and assembling the rest of the engine. We got a lot of work to do, so let's get started. Before I get underway, I want to quickly remove this upper engine mount bracket. And this bad boy was on there. Look at this, I'm using an impact gun to take this off, and look how much time it's taken. And here's the VOES from the other side. I started unpacking more parts that I'll be needing for the upcoming steps. I'm going to use these head bolts next, so we're going to take those and prep them. The head bolts are dropped into a plastic container, and I add industrial degreaser to it. Initially, I figured I would just use a toothbrush or something to clean up the bolts and the thread work, and that didn't really do the job for me. I tried it out, and then I upgraded to a brass brush to try and get within the thread work. And I tried cleaning it again, and that really didn't work either. So ultimately, not being happy with that, I then upgraded to a brass brush on a Dremel. And the Dremel did the job, clean up the threads like new. I really need clean threads to do this job. If you can't get the threads clean, you're going to have to replace all the bolts. So this worked. We could stay with these bolts. They're nice and clean now. It just took some time to get it to this level. Like new. I'll require my 9/16 torque adapter for the next step. I have my head gaskets that were included in my James top-end rebuild kit. I'm going to put the rear head on first because there's a lot less clearance in this area. It's harder to work with. We'll remove our temporary dust cover and this paper towel from the oil fitting. This is the bolt that should have been secured before the cylinder was lowered onto the block, or you're not going to be able to get this bolt in now. You're going to have a problem. As you can see on my engine, I have made my own mistake, for which I'm going to have to raise this up because somehow I managed to forget the washer. So it does happen to everyone if you're not careful. So I grabbed one of the head gaskets and I inspect it on both sides to make sure there's no debris on there. Everything appears to look good, and I place it matching the oil ports onto the cylinder. And I'll just show you I'm placing it down and I'm aligning the oil hole and aligning the other hole, and we could see that you can put it on upside down, so it's important to note that. So I'm going to flip it over. As I flip it over, you can see every hole lines up. So there's only one right way to lay this thing down. Because the head's not on yet, it wasn't a big deal for me to remove the base bolts and raise the cylinder slightly, remove that bolt, put the washer on it, and put the bolt back in. I had to do retorquing procedure, but you'll see later in the video that's just going to appear with the washer back in the correct position, not in order in this video, so it looks a little bit strange because I hadn't realized it yet at this point, but I am applying oil to the bolt after I had secured the gasket into place. The mating surfaces on the bottom of the head are re-cleaned one last time. The head is then fit into position over the cylinder, trying to approximate for the lineup of the holes that the bolts will then go through. The front facing of the rocker box makes this indication easy. That first bolt is finger turned 3/4 of the way. I take the next bolt, oil the threads, insert it, and turn that one 3/4 of the way as well. If the threads are clean and the heads are aligned to the holes, all of these should turn in by hand with zero effort. And then onto the next bolt with the same procedure. And when I'm oiling the threads, these threads are very lightly oiled. This is followed by the fourth and then the fifth bolt. This leaving all 5 bolts at about 3/4 in, all hand tightened, No resistance needed because all the threads are clean. This head can't be tightened yet because it still needs to be adjusted and set up against the other head, yet to be installed. So I just ran up the bolts just a couple millimeters short of the top so it could still be adjusted, and we're going to leave it here. Just going to cover the spark plug hole with some paper towel and tape to make sure no contaminants get in the combustor chamber. At this point, the exact same process will be repeated, this time for the front cylinder. Again, ensuring that one bolt and washer was pre-installed correctly, pre-oiling that bolt, cleaning the mating surface, then finally lowering the head onto the cylinder. Again, the head will have to be rotated correctly to align the hole to the bolt, at which point you'll be able to thread the bolt through into the head. And the same procedure of loading all the bolts 3/4 of a turn after they're oiled will be done just as before. And then all just a couple millimeters shy of the top. And again, finally, the spark plug hole is covered. Now we have both cylinders on. We're going to be using the intake manifold here to set the angle between the two heads. And we can see how this will be seated on there. The angle should be the same. The vacuum port here will be facing upward. We're going to mesh it just like that. And as I hold this up and look at the angle, I can see as it protrudes, I'm able to adjust both heads one at a time. I bring the angle inward until it's in an optimal pitch. It matches the same angle as the manifold itself. And I'm eyeballing all this is how I'm doing it. Taking a look here from all angles as I place it back in, make sure that everything appears to line up correctly. Also checking from the back as well. Working with one head at a time, I'll hold it with my hand to secure it in place. Draw up just one of the head bolts, and then using that torque extension, I'm just going to tighten it down. And then I'll do one more. I'm just snugging them. I'm just doing it so the head stays still. And as I do this, I recheck to make sure my alignment hasn't shifted. I'll do the same thing with the other head now, holding it in position as I tighten down two of these bolts that I have direct access to. This first one here and this one just off to the right of it. Again, the manifold is used to remeasure, make sure everything is still aligned. This is also observed from the rear of the engine as well. This looks like a good setup, so we're going to lock down the heads. At this point, I'm going to tighten down each of the bolts to uniform tightness, just using my hand with the extension. I'm really only getting a couple of foot-pounds onto each one. I'm just looking for uniformity and the removal of slack. This is the accepted Shovelhead torquing sequence. I'm going to keep this paper by the bike, keeping record of where I am as I do this. We're going to start by setting our torque wrench to 25 foot-pounds. We'll be doing the back head first. The torque extension always at 90 degrees, and I don't plan on getting a click out of this first turn. I'm basically doing it on each one by angle, probably getting them all to about half the torque, probably about 12 foot-pounds. I'm just going around each one in that specific order that's on the paper. I'll point out as we get to the fifth one, I do use an extension as shown here, and my finger's not pushing it. I'm just making sure if it slips, it doesn't bang into anything. I give it another turn because I didn't get a lot of room out of that one. Second go around gets us to 25. Again, I'm not pulling the extension, I'm just protecting it. Annotate here that 25 was completed and move on to the next step. We're going to set it up now for 50 foot-pounds. This is going to be the exact same process again. I'm going to give it a little bit of a turn, but I don't want to go too far because what I want to happen is when I reach that click, I want to be in a turning motion in the moment that it clicks. I don't want it to click because of the initial pushing of the torque wrench. So I'm giving it just a little bit on each one, and then I'm stopping, and then I'm going to come around a second time to give it a little more and allow for it to reach the 50 foot-pounds, as we'll see here in a moment. With that, I annotate 50 pounds and we move on. That completes this head. I'll annotate it. We'll do the other one the exact same manner. Two important things to remember through all this. Number one, the torque extension must always be at 90 degrees as shown here on the torque wrench. And number two, that when you reach that final torque, it should always be during the motion of the torque wrench. That the torque wrench is being pulled in a constant motion when you hear that click. The cleaning and the light oiling the threads helped to ensure that when we heard the click, it was accurate with regard to the measurement of the torque. Only now that the heads have been torqued down and both gaskets compressed, we could put the engine mount back on. Here's the old one. This is the mount that goes on to the actual heads. And I have a replacement. We're going to put this on in its stead. We can see as I take this apart, everything on here is substandard. Look at this washer. It's completely concave. The bolt may be okay, but it's going to be replaced. This other washer can concave as well. So we're back at Ace, determining thread size is 7/16/20. And here's all the parts. And I'm already getting the replacements here from the drawers. We got washers and lock washers, bolts, nuts. Picked up some 1/2-inch washers as well. And this should be enough to get started. Putting this first washer around the VOES, I see that the washer is just a little too big. So I've shaved a small flat into it. And now it sits flush into the VOES bracket. Drop that 1/2-inch washer around the other side of the bracket. It's a lot more robust than the washer that was there previously by a magnitude. We'll bring this whole thing through. We'll drop the mounting bracket on top of this. And then a washer over the bracket, followed by a lock washer. Then I'll just loosely tighten it with the new nut that I purchased, just enough so it doesn't fall apart here. And I see it still allows for deflection. Change gears for a moment, and I'm going to clean that upper oil line. A little carb cleaner, and I'm going to run some air through it. Applying a little bit of oil to the seals that are on the fittings of this oil line. Remembering my chamfered end faces the front rocker box, it's able to seat in slightly inside there, allowing for this to be rotated, and the back one fits over the hole so I can push it back in till everything breaks free. And that's how I get it in between the two, because it can recess slightly in the front. So I push the seals back into position, and then I push the fittings down, and I'm able to just finger turn them in. Then using 2 1/2-inch wrenches, I'll hold one side so I don't rotate the fitting that's in the rocker box, and I will gently tighten while I hold the pipe, because I don't want the pipe to rotate. I want it pointed straight up and down. So as it starts getting tighter, I'm going to have to hold it with my hand. Right now it's not an issue. Now I'm going to have to start to hold it as I tighten this down. As I get these to the final tightness, I want to make sure, first of all, the pipe is again straight up and down, and then I want to match the flats from the connectors so it looks symmetrical. We'll get started with the bottom oil line now. This is chamfered on the top side of that line, so I could push it up into the rocker box just a little bit as shown, give me the required clearance to be able to fit it in the fitting on the bottom. And now I'll be able to work it back out of the rocker box and seat it properly. And it's connected using the same technique. There is an angle which this pipe curves that I also like to maintain as I tighten it. So I'm checking to make sure that the pipe hasn't rotated away from the bottom. I use 2 fingers to tighten the bottom as I hold the pipe into position. And that concludes the oil lines. You'll notice that I got the old mount back on and I had skipped ahead to the oil lines, trying to resolve for this issue right here. I'll show you. I put the old mount on and everything's flush. We can see on both sides it fits perfectly over to the engine. I'm going to drop on the new mount and we'll see the problem here, the lack of quality. Look at this gap on the front side here. This is just asking to crack a mount on the engine. We can't have that at all. And I'm going to put the old mount on top. You can see clearly the angle's different. People say you could bang it into shape, but I don't see a point. They also asked if I would do it with the washers in place. You can see the old one fits just fine. The new one still has that hideous gap over here. And if I'm just going to use the right part, I'm going to put the old one on. We're just going to go with it. And I'm going to return the other one to J&P. So I'm just going to tighten down these nuts. We'll get underway. We'll be setting the torque wrench to 40 foot-pounds. The goal here is to get everything really tight without anything being under stress. So we see everything wiggles. I'm going to hand tighten these 2 nuts first. The rest of the mount is free floating. I'll be using this crow's foot as a torque extender. Of course, it's imperative that the crow's foot is always tightening at exactly 90 degrees to get an accurate reading. Those 2 bolts are done. Nothing here is under any stress. I'm going to remove this bolt. I'm going to get that into the right position. We can see that this bolt slides in and out. No stress at all on that mount pushed up against the frame. Also making sure the VOES is in the right position. Also have a wrench here to hold in place. We'll butt up everything against each other, making sure everything is flush, and then we'll start tightening down just a couple turns so that we can reevaluate. With everything pushed together, if I can push that bolt up and down freely, it tells me nothing's binding. I continue to torque it down significantly tighter and recheck. Seeing no gap here on the side, around, or below, with the nut being free and this being torqued, I can now add the nyloc nut on the bottom. And this will be tightened down to really tight. Finish off this one really tight. And that completes the top engine mount. Pushrod installation will be the last task in this chapter. They've been taped up in groups since the removal. Here's the rear exhaust one we'll be starting with. Exhaust is always on the outside of the cylinder. I'll only be opening up one at a time so I don't forget which one goes where. We can see these things are looking pretty nasty. Everything's going to need to be completely disassembled. And then once all the components are disassembled, everything's going to be degreased and then reassembled. My kit came with cork and rubber O-rings. I've had good success with the rubber ones, so I'm going to use them. I'm going to take off the dust cap. I have to bring the lifter to lowest position, and I usually use the kicker to do this, but I don't have a transmission right now. So I'm just going around back and rotating the engine till the cam drops this valve to the lowest position. Put a light coat of oil on the thread since it was degreased to ensure that it doesn't rust. Some oil on the split lock nut too, and then I'll run that lock nut back up onto this adjustment here, all the way up. Then we'll run that back into the push rod. Then we'll start reassembling the pieces for the push rod tube with the spring, giving everything oil for rust prevention. Then there's a washer here behind the spring, followed by brand new O-ring, the right size, compared against the old one. Put some oil on that as well. Put this on, and then this slides right into the outer chrome tube. There's an O-ring that needs to go down here. And I use the pushrod tube just to seat it properly. There's another O-ring that's sized that will also go on the top of the pushrod tube, just like that. Pushrod is inserted into the tube, adjust the side down. Make sure I don't knock anything out of the way while doing that. And then it will be put into the head where the rocker is that receives the end of the push rod. It'll sit there centered because it's concave. Now I'll extend the adjuster to draw out the slack and just put the slightest amount of tension on the lifter. Secure everything out of the way with a clothespin. Everybody who owns a Shovelhead should have a standard lifter adjustment gauge. It's no surprise that the lift is going to start way too high. A thin profile wrench is an absolute must for this procedure. Fits right up here. I started using the wrenches to turn them, one to hold, one to turn, and realized that without oiling them pumped up under pressure, very easy to turn. I could do it even by hand, only stopping to retake a measurement. And I'll repeat this a number of times till I'm satisfied with the measurement, going back and forth. At this point, we could see, taking a close-up look, that they're both perfectly lined up right over here at this line, and now we could lock it down. So I'm going to turn the lock nut all the way up to the top. I've got my first wrench there. The second wrench will sit parallel to it, top and bottom. Third wrench will be placed in the middle, and that'll be counter-rotated against those two to tighten it in position. Going to snug it down real good. Now drop the clothespin. Pull this inner tube upward so that the seal goes all the way up to the top of the rocker box. Push the other tube downward. And now we'll put this insert in place at under tension. Holds everything together, so we'll pull this piece down. This is spring loaded. Lock it in. And there we go. Roll the rear intake lifted to the lowest position and repeat the process. Each time again, the parts are inspected for wear. These were all still good, so it's reassembled. The procedures for putting them in is exactly the same for the intake as it is for the exhaust. And the front is done just like the rear. Well, that concludes this chapter in this FXS Lowrider restoration. I hope you found it enjoyable, entertaining, insightful, educational. Click that like button down below. Helps me out a lot when you do. Click that subscribe button for more videos when they come out. Click that button on the top right for the next video when it comes out in this series. Again, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching. Would you like to reply?